Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Jocelyn Davis, and I'm the marketing coordinator here at DoubleRadius. We're excited you're here with us for a special webinar on 5.9 GHz and 6 GHz that we're calling Battle of the Bands. Our guest speaker today is Steve Coran from DC law firm Lerman Senter. As a communications lawyer, Steve's focus is spectrum, broadband, internet governance programs, and technology. And as you're about to find out, he brings a wealth of industry knowledge. In fact, we've asked Steve to write some articles for our blog this fall on other important topics. So if you aren't already subscribed to our blog, make sure to subscribe today to receive notifications when these articles are released. To subscribe, go to blog.doubleradius.com and sign up there. Before I turn it over to Steve to get us started, just a quick couple housekeeping items. Throughout the course of the presentation, please enter any questions you have into the questions box. We'll do our best to address all of them, but the sooner you enter your questions, the better. We will answer questions after each individual section. And when the webinar is over, a survey will pop up on your screen. It will take just a minute, and we really appreciate your feedback. And with that, I'll hand it over now to Steve Coran to get us started.
Well, thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you to everybody at DoubleRadius for inviting me to do some blog posting and a series of presentations and podcasts for you all. It's not exactly like getting on a cruise ship, but in these times it will have to do for all of us. Welcome and great to be with you all. Let me get my housekeeping out of the way and just note the disclaimer that the presentation I'm going to give today is not intended to create an attorney-client relationship, and this information is general and not offered as legal advice. If you want legal advice, talk to your attorney, or if you want tax advice or financial advice, talk to your other advisors if you have questions. And note that the information in this presentation is taken at your own risk, but I do think it will be very educational. So we're calling this the Battle of the Bands, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But another way to look at this is the recent past, the present, and the future, because we do have the 6 GHz band spectrum that has already been allocated for unlicensed use, and we'll talk a little bit about the rules and where we're going with that. Second, we'll talk about what's been going on in the adjacent 5.9 GHz band for point to multi-point use as well. And then as a special bonus, we'll talk about a couple of other bands that are in play. So first, let's get going here on what's going on in 6 GHz. Last year, the FCC launched a rulemaking proceeding, and what it wanted to do is to see if there were ways where we could share the 1200 megahertz that straddles the 6 GHz band. There are already licensed incumbents in that band used by public safety, critical information infrastructure, and yes, even WISPs who are using that for point-to-point microwave backhaul and DIA. Utilities were very opposed to this and remain opposed to this because they're concerned about the potential for harmful interference to their licensed links. But despite that, and with a lot of pushing by the chipset manufacturers, the cable companies, and WISPA, the FCC did adopt an order in April that allocates 1200 megahertz overall for unlicensed use. All of that is usable or will be usable for low power indoor communications for what's being referred to as Wi-Fi 6. They're required to use a contention-based protocol. 850 megahertz of that spectrum will be used for what's referred to as standard power and for outdoor operations. And this band is split between the U-NII-5 and the U-NII-7 bands. Those might be new names, but they're basically an extension of the 5 gigahertz band that many WISPs use. Operation in these bands must be under control of something called the automated frequency coordination, and we will be talking about that. So here is a picture of the band plan, and I'll just leave that up for a couple of seconds for folks to take a look at. So as you can see, the U-NII-5 band covers 5950 to 6425, and the U-NII-7 band is 6525 to 6875. And those are the bands that are shared between fixed uses and fixed satellite uplinks. There's no issue of interference with uplinks because they are sending a lot of signal up into the sky, not receiving. So those don't present any interference issues. And throughout this band, U-NII-5 all the way through U-NII-8, that's available for low power indoor service under rules that we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about today because I know that's not the focus of this group. So here's another chart that shows what the power limits are. And as you can see, the U-NII-5 and the U-NII-7 power limits at the access point are the same as what we have in U-NII-3, I want to say. And the low power indoor access point is going to be a bit lower, especially at the receiver side. So I mentioned the AFC before, the Automated Frequency Coordination, and this is intended to enable unlicensed use and at the same time protect Part 101 licensed microwave links from harmful interference. It's good here to point out that WISPA came to this proceeding having a unique perspective among all stakeholders. On one hand, there are a lot of WISP that use the 6 GHz band for licensed point-to-point service for backhaul or for enterprise connectivity or other point-to-point uses. And our first order of business was to make sure that those links are not subject to harmful interference. By the same token, WISPA has been very at the forefront of spectrum sharing, and we saw an opportunity here based on other bands where spectrum is shared, like the TV whitespace band and CBRS, to leverage that experience and say, hey, we think we can draw some buffers around these licensed links, protect them from interference, but use some of the airspace around them for point-to-multipoint service. So that's what the FCC came up with. So what is the AFC? It's similar to the spectrum access system that we have in CBRS, but it's actually much simpler to implement. You don't have any government use, you don't have any mobile use, and you don't have multiple tiers of access like you do with GAA and PALS and incumbent access in CBRS. You're really just dealing with two things: incumbent operations that are licensed and everything around that has to protect those licensed services. And as I mentioned, you don't need the AFC to protect satellite uplinks because there's no potential for harmful interference to the receivers that are located in the Clark Belt about 36,000 kilometers above the equator. So what's the model of AFC that the FCC has adopted? It's a centralized model with each access point having the requirement to access the AFC and obtain a list of available frequency ranges in a particular geographic area to get authorization to operate. This is similar to what we have in the TV whitespace database, which is a bit more rudimentary because it was built a long time ago and doesn't have a lot of the features that we now can incorporate, and less sophisticated than the SAS that we use for CBRS. The AFC is going to rely on the FCC's universal licensing service for information on incumbent operations. So if you are a licensee, if you hold a license in this band, you should make sure that the information that is in your license file in ULS is accurate. And if it's not accurate, you need to take steps to modify your license, to make minor modifications or corrections in order to make sure that good information and accurate information is provided to the AFC. Very important to do. Doesn't necessarily need to be done now, but I would never encourage anybody to operate in a manner that is inconsistent with their license. The AFC will then incorporate that information on location and antenna height for standard power access points and apply interference protection parameters and decide when and where certain frequencies can be used. Now, the unlicensed devices have to be a little bit more intelligent than what we have in the uniband in the 5 gigahertz band. So, in the sense that they have to incorporate geolocation capability. So they have to be able to obtain coordinates from either a GPS source, or where you can't get access to GPS or other geolocation services, some internal geolocation source. So there are places where you may not be able to get GPS, and that is where this comes into play. Note that for point to multi-point operations, outdoor standard power, professional installation is not required. The idea here is that the device itself will be intelligent enough and deployed in a way that will inform the AFC as to whether it's been installed correctly. Information must include the height above ground of the access point. If you're too high, or if you're in an area where you might cause interference, you might get a red light and won't be able to operate from that particular location on those particular frequencies. And importantly, the device has to check the AFC at least once a day, so it obtains the latest list of available frequencies. The reason is that you may have more licensed services that the FCC authorizes. You may have licensees that turn in their licenses. So the database that the AFC uses may change over time, and that's why there's this requirement to check at least once a day to make sure that you're still operating on good frequencies. And if you're not, then you go back to the AFC, and the AFC may be able to return you different frequencies that you could use. The FCC adopted 3 different propagation models. So for short distances, it uses the free space model. Medium distances, it uses something called the Winner 2 model. And for long distances, it uses the Longley-Rice irregular terrain model, which more realistically accounts for clutter and terrain losses, and is regarded to be a pretty accurate assessment of real-world interference. Okay, so who's responsible for putting together this AFC? Similar to what we've seen in CBRS with the Wireless Innovation Forum, the design of the AFC has been delegated to a multi-stakeholder group called MSG, not something you'd get in a Chinese restaurant, but that's the name that it's been given. And the MSG is developing best practices, standards, and protocols for the AFC. It was formed by WinForum and the Wi-Fi Alliance in July, and it now includes, I understand, about 200 different companies, entities, trade associations. That includes WISPA, Wi-Fi Alliance, chip manufacturers, equipment companies, cable companies, mobile companies, utilities, public safety, etc. Richard Bernhardt from WISPA is one of the 4 co-chairs of the steering committee. They've had several meetings, and I think there's another meeting scheduled for later this month as they develop what this what the AFC looks like. So there could be multiple AFC operators. They will be selected just like we saw with the SAS and CBRS through a multi-stage review process. They will submit proposals to the FCC. There will be a public comment period and lab and field testing before any of these AFCs are authorized. They would be authorized for a 5-year term. They can charge fees, and they do not need to synchronize each other so long as they're all obviously tapping into the same ULS database for the license information. So that's where the rules are at the moment, and that's the work that the MSG is working on. But the FCC is considering some additional rules for the 6 gigahertz band, and we won't talk about all of them. We're just going to talk a little bit about one of them. So very low operation. That's one of the things the FCC is asking about. Should it increase the PSD for low power operations Should it allow mobile standard power access point operation, something that the mobile carriers would like? And should the FCC authorize even higher power limits and allow point-to-point or other antenna directionality for standard power access points? So WISPA was responsible, I would say, for getting this fourth item in the further notice of proposed rulemaking, and it's seeking rules that harmonize the U-NII-1 and U-NII-3 higher power limits for point-to-point operations for backhaul and internet connectivity, and is also asking for the AFC to recognize directional antennas with a professional installation requirement. So let me talk about each of those. First, harmonizing the higher power limits with U-NII-1 and U-NII-3 will make the equipment more uniform across the bands, although you will need to have the geolocation capability here that you don't have in 5 gigahertz. This has been opposed by some folks who say, why don't you just get a Part 101 license and go through the coordination process? And there may be some truth to that, but the point is, why should the FCC limit flexibility if you want to provide point-to-point operations on an unlicensed basis? So if you want to go the license route, you can get a license under Part 101, just like you do today in the 6 gigahertz band. This provides an unlicensed option. The second point, which is directional antennas, would allow the AFC to not treat every antenna as if it is a point-to-multipoint antenna, and therefore you should be able to use the spectrum more efficiently and in more places. Why do we have professional installation? Well, when you put an omni antenna up, doesn't really matter. You can define the area very clearly. However, it's important when you put a directional antenna up that it be pointed in the right direction, because you may get a clear signal on certain frequencies to the east, but you would be interfering if you pointed that to the west. So that's why we think the professional installation is a necessary safeguard and element for the FCC to include. There have also been some petitions for reconsideration and some appeals filed with the courts. CTIA wants the FCC to license a portion of the band and relocate incumbents. I refer to this as LTE versus Wi-Fi. I don't believe that this is going to be a successful petition, and I don't even think that CTIA believes it will be. CTIA and Verizon want to raise the maximum EIRP even higher to 42 dBm. The big threat here is the public safety and the utility interests, which mostly oppose the rules for the low power indoor devices. What they say is that these low power devices should be also subject to the AFC. Well, that has a tendency to blow out the business model that is predicated on being able to buy routers and other unlicensed devices and Wi-Fi off the shelf at Best Buy. So if you have to have an AFC, that business model isn't going to work. There was a lot of back and forth in the record about interference potential and aggregate interference, and the FCC decided that they were comfortable that for low power indoor, you did not need to incorporate the AFC for that. And they're also critical of this delegation to the AFC for the process. They think it should have been the FCC, but as we pointed out before, the FCC has a lot of safeguards before it approves the AFC, namely application, public comment, lab testing, field testing before it will be authorized, just as we've had in CBRS. And they also tend to think that it will be difficult to track down interference if it occurs to licensed operations. Again, that can be something that the AFC can help enforce. Some of these concerns, especially from the public safety side, have been raised in appeals pending with the DC Court of Appeals. So we will see what happens there. So I think this is the point, and I probably blew way past it where we were supposed to do a poll. So before we go on, and my apologies to the DoubleRadius folks for not remembering to do the poll earlier, why don't we stop here and do the first poll.
So for poll results, yes was 57%, maybe was 38%, and no was 5%.
Okay. And did we do the second question on 6 gigahertz?
We can put that one up right now.
Thank you.
Are you concerned about the unlicensed use of the 6 gigahertz band might interfere with your licensed point-to-point operations? 34% said yes, and 66% said no.
Okay. Okay, well, that's interesting to hear because I know a lot of effort and a lot of development will go into the AFC. So hopefully those of you who are in the 34% range will feel better about things when as the process goes forward. Okay, so before we kind of wrap up 6 gigahertz, let me just kind of do a brief summary here. So just to tout what WISPA's accomplishments have been in this band. So even before the FCC adopted the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking in 2019, we went to the FCC and we got them to ask questions about standard power operations. Before then, the FCC was only going to consider the low power indoor option that Broadcom, Apple, HP, Microsoft, Google, and other folks were supporting. Then we coordinated closely with those folks to obtain support for the standard power operations, and we in turn supported low power indoor rules not requiring the AFC for the simple reason that it's a good idea to have more parking spots for unlicensed devices in homes, whether it's routers or whether it's broadband connectivity or other devices that people are using more and more. So we kind of felt that getting their support for our position and providing that support in return would help enable the ecosystem writ large. Then, before the FCC adopted the order and the further notice of proposed rulemaking, we successfully asked the FCC to include the question on point-to-point operations in the directional antennas. And as I pointed out, WISPA has a leadership role in the multi-stakeholder group that will be developing the AFC. So this has been touted as probably one of the best things to happen to unlicensed spectrum in 20 years. And I think it's a credit to our community and WISPA's leadership and our ability to work with the FCC and with other stakeholders to get where we are today. So really pleased with the outcome of this proceeding. So before we go on to the 5.9 band, now's a good opportunity to stop and see if there's any questions.
All right, Steve, so we have 2 questions. The first one is, have you heard when vendors will be coming out with hardware/firmware to use for this?
I have not, but I would imagine that that will be happening in parallel with the development of the AFC, because the protocols and the practices that are built into that database will also have to be incorporated into the devices. And I think a number of the manufacturers are involved in the MSG. I would imagine that they would leverage their existing 5 gigahertz equipment and then develop the software and firmware they need to incorporate the AFC to pull the FCC's database and so forth. So we're kind of hoping the AFC can get done within a 1-year time frame. That's kind of what we're looking at. So I would encourage you to talk to your vendors as you see them at trade shows, or talk to them virtually and see what they're thinking about this particular band and whether they're going to be developing products and what their roadmap is.
And for our second question, why do we not just keep 6 gigahertz in the unlicensed space? 2.4 and 5 gigahertz options have been around a long time and work very well as unlicensed spectrum.
So good question, and I think a lot of WISP would tell you that those bands are pretty saturated right now. There's no more 900 or 2.4, and in a lot of places, no 5 gigahertz, and even in some places I've heard, not even any legacy 3650 to 3700. I've also heard that WISP were facing issues in 5 gigahertz because more connections for unlicensed devices in the homes were hogging that bandwidth. And so, as I said, having more parking spots, meaning spectrum parking spots for more unlicensed devices, will relieve that congestion. And I think that's probably really important during the COVID pandemic, when more folks are using more bandwidth in their homes to remote learn, work from home, and use telemedicine. So let's talk now about the 5.9 gigahertz rulemaking proceeding, and I will remember that we have a poll coming up at the end of this slide, so learn my lesson. In November of 2019, the FCC adopted a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking in which it proposed rules to segment the 75 megahertz between 5850 and 5925. This is a proceeding that actually began about 3 or 4 years ago. The FCC asked some questions about should we allow shared use between unlicensed devices and the existing licensed uses, or should we split the band up and have a certain amount allocated for unlicensed and take this licensed services and make it a smaller bandwidth. So the 75 megahertz is currently allocated for something called Dedicated Short-Range Communications, or DSRC. It's a licensed service, and it's used as a safety technology in vehicles. The FCC's proposal is to split the band into 2 different pieces. One is the U-NII-4 band, which is 5850 to 5895, that's 45 megahertz, and then take the 75 megahertz of spectrum and squeeze that down into the upper 30 megahertz between 5895 and 5925, and keep that as a licensed service for transportation and vehicle safety purposes. Car manufacturers are proposing a new technology that they call Cellular Vehicle to Everything, or CV2X. This proposal is supported by WISPA and the cable industry and the Wi-Fi interests. It's opposed by the automobile industry. Of course, they have 75 megahertz, and they'd like to hang on to that. So let's stop right there before we go on. And Jocelyn, you want to put up the next poll question, please?
How helpful has the 5850 and the 5895 megahertz band been for meeting demand? 26% said very helpful, 5% said somewhat helpful, 7% said not helpful, and 63% responded with not applicable.
Okay. And let's, I think there's a second question there, so maybe we can post that one. Okay, so our answers to the question are, would you like to see 5850 to 5895 megahertz band made available for unlicensed use? So what's the percentage there, 90 something?
96% said yes and 4% said no.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about this. During the pandemic, the FCC has granted more than 100 special temporary authorizations to allow operations in this 5850 to 5895 megahertz band. Some manufacturers were able to quickly implement this access through firmware upgrade. Others took a little bit more time. And the STAs do have limitations. They can't be within 75 kilometers of a designated military installation or within 2 kilometers of one of these licensed roadside units. They have to provide notice to affected licensees and have to stop operating if interference is reported. This additional 45 megahertz has helped WISPs handle access in demand to accommodate remote learning, work from home, and telemedicine. Many of these STAs have been extended and renewed and are ongoing today. The first batch was granted in, I want to say early April, and the FCC has enabled continuing use of this spectrum by those who have STAs and want to continue to get the benefit of this additional spectrum. So really pleased with the way this has worked out, not just for current purposes, but for its impact on advocacy. And for that, I would point to this. The FCC has, as I mentioned, granted renewals of the STAs, and I'm not aware of any instances where there's been harmful interference. Understand these STAs had to be discussed and negotiated and coordinated with NTIA and the Department of Defense. And the FCC would not have allowed the access to this band unless it had these conditions in place and unless it had the approval of these other agencies. So there was a lot of back and forth between FCC staff and these other agencies in order to get those STAs approved. I'm not sure if everybody knew that that was going on behind the scenes. One thing it has done is it's proved that shared co-channel access is possible so long as you respect those geographic exclusion areas that I mentioned before. You stay 75 kilometers away from a military installation and 2 kilometers away from the roadside units in the few places where they exist. So this helps make the case for continuous and expanded use of the band in certain areas before licensees are migrated from the entire 75 megahertz to 30 megahertz of spectrum. So what that does is that informs seamless, it informs our advocacy for seamless access during the band during the transitional process. The idea here, we won't have to wait for the licensees to vacate that 45 megahertz of spectrum. We can use it alongside of them in these certain areas and hopefully allow these STAs and other folks who may want to get special temporary authority to continue to operate and meet consumer demand during this time of excessive demand. So we know the FCC is considering this. They're requiring coordination and approval of NTIA, as I mentioned, and we're hopeful that we might see some rules on this by the end of the year. So we'll see where that lands. There's a lot of tension between the FCC and the Department of Transportation, between typical communications companies and the auto industry. This is a band that the FCC allocated 20 years ago, and it's vastly underutilized. And the reason is because the FCC dictated a particular use and a particular technology. And when the FCC does that, a lot of times the band does not flourish. If you look back over the same 20-year period, look at the way that Wi-Fi and other unlicensed technologies have been able to innovate and flourish, whereas you only have, I wouldn't say a handful, but a relatively few licensed services that are actually up and operating and providing vehicle safety functions. You also have things like OnStar and other unlicensed spectrum uses that have developed as well. So the point being that you may not need licensed services at all in order to provide the kind of vehicle to vehicle or vehicle to intersection or intersection to vehicle safety features that are envisioned for this band. So that's where we are on the 5.9 gigahertz band. And I think where we want to go with this is take some additional questions before we wrap up with a couple of other bands that are under discussion. So any questions?
We have two more questions. The first one, the FCC has auctioned the amateur 3.3 to 3.5 gigahertz allocation. Is there a way to share the 3.65 band?
So we're going to talk about that on the next 2 slides. So the answer is that we're going to talk about what the FCC is doing in the spectrum below 3.55.
All right, and then the next one, someone asked if Lerman Senter can help with getting an STA.
Well, we've done that for about 40 or 50 folks, so I think the answer is going to be yes. And I think the last slide has my contact information on it, so feel free to contact me after we're done and we can help you prepare the application. It consists of a Form 601, a narrative statement that explains where you want the STA and demonstrates the need for the additional spectrum to meet demand. And then the FCC also requires something called a stop buzzer exhibit. And this identifies a person, a phone number, and an email address that can be contacted in the event that there's interference to a military installation or something like that, and they have to call you right away and say, shut it down. So it's a pretty simple process. The filing fee is $70, and our fees are generally in the $500 to $1,000 range. I think renewals are going less because we already have kind of an established narrative for that particular operator. Thanks for the questions. So let's wrap up and talk about a few things that are a little further off into the future. So the first band is the 4.9 gigahertz band, and this covers the 4940 to 4990 megahertz band. That's 50 megahertz that sits right below the 5.1 Uni-1 band. Like the 5.9 band, it is vastly underutilized. It's allocated for public safety entities, but only about 3% of public safety entities are using this particular spectrum band. And as a result, you've seen not just, you have not seen an equipment ecosystem develop, and that means that not many public safety entities are using the spectrum, so it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So at its meeting just about 2 weeks ago, the FCC adopted an order, kind of a novel approach. It's going to say, every state, you appoint someone within the state, and they are going to be able to lease the spectrum to commercial entities. So that means that a WISP could go to their particular state broadband leasing agent or person or department and ask for access to that particular licensed spectrum. This is not ready yet. How we implement that is something that the FCC is now inviting comment on. The public safety interests are very, very strongly opposed to this. And there are certain commissioners in the FCC who think that the FCC have kind of moved too fast on this, and maybe there is not a solid record on which to build this particular licensing and leasing model. I do expect that this is going to face a lot of opposition as we go forward. It would not surprise me to find out that this that the FCC ultimately changes to a more traditional licensing model or does what public safety does. So this is where we are now. I think there will be some pretty significant changes before we are able to use that particular spectrum. And then finally, the FCC also at that September 30 meeting adopted a further notice of proposed rulemaking that's going to allocate 100 megahertz just below the CBRS band for commercial use. There's additional spectrum, I think that was in one of the questions, between 3.1 and 3.45 that is still on the table. The incumbencies there, meaning the federal government, make it a little bit more challenging at this point to move that spectrum forward. So the first thing that happens here is that amateurs and weather radars are going to be moved out of this band to other bands, and amateurs, if I remember correctly, are going to be relocated to bands that they choose. So in the further notice of proposed rulemaking, the FCC is asking, okay, how should we go about allocating the spectrum? And what they're asking for is, what they're proposing is to make this look like C-band, which uses partial economic areas. There's about 416 of those around the country. These are groups of counties. There are 3,230 something counties. So these are about 8 times larger than counties, if I have my math right. Might make that 7 times larger. 20 megahertz blocks and higher power like we see in C-band. So WISPA and some of its allies got together and asked the FCC to have this further notice consider something that looks more like CBRS, which is county-based licenses, 10 megahertz blocks, lower power rules, and opportunistic use. There's a lot of government push and obviously support from the mobile community to adopt C-band type rules. And one of the purposes of getting the FCC to expand this out a little bit and consider the CBRS approach is, once again, we think that once the FCC transitions after the election, that we may be able to have more friendly folks who prefer that particular approach. We expect that comments will be due by the end of the year. They'll be due 30 days from Federal Register publication. So that'll probably occur in the next couple of weeks, and then we'll be on the 30-day clock to advocate for those rules. And I think that puts us at the end of the line here. And so there's my information on how to contact me. And I'm happy to take any additional questions that that people may have.
Well, if that's it, thank you, Steve. Don't forget to subscribe to us on our blog at blog.doubleradius.com if you want to get more information from Steve. And as we close out, please remember to take our quick survey that'll pop up on your screen. And again, thanks you guys for joining us today, and stay safe.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.